August 2, 1990, the whole world is just watching, totally stunned as Saddam Hussein's Iraq suddenly invades Kuwait. But then, only 6 months later, the Iraqi army is in a complete panic, retreating from a massive coalition led by the US in what became known as the First Gulf War. So, how did this supposed victory for Saddam in Kuwait end up uniting Western, Arab, and even Soviet nations against him? And how did it lead to such a swift and devastating defeat in a war that lasted just 100 hours? Asterisk if you're new to the channel. Welcome to War Clock. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video with your friends. This is a crazy story, and this is just the beginning. Asterisk, the story really starts in 1988, when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein signed a ceasefire, finally ending a brutal 7-year war with Iran. It had been a disaster for Iraq. They had lost 600,000. People gained almost nothing on the battlefield, and now were drowning in debt. Baghdad owed its foreign creditors a staggering $80 billion. And it was going to cost another $230 billion just to rebuild all the cities and towns that were destroyed. On top of that, his million-man army, the fourth largest on the planet, was costing an insane 40% of their annual GDP. The country was facing high unemployment. And maybe worst of all, oil prices were at an all-time low. Saddam desperately wanted OPEC to raise them, but the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait completely refused. They were protecting their own profits, and by doing so, were keeping prices down. Asterisk for Hussein. These were huge threats to his power. He relied on big military and social spending to keep his rule secure, and any cuts could spark an uprising or a challenge from within. Throughout the 1980s, Saddam had already been brutally cracking down on minorities, like the Shiite Faili Kurds, because he thought they were secretly supporting Iran. But he saw a potential solution to his financial and security problems right next door in a much smaller country. Kuwait was holding $10 billion of Iraqi debt and was producing too much oil, so Saddam figured he could just demand cash and debt cancellation to fix his financial mess. He also started putting pressure on the other Gulf states, arguing that Iraq's war with Iran had protected them from radical Islam, and that, because of that, Iraq deserved a big financial reward. Asterisk, in February 1990, Saddam began twisting arms, urging Jordan and Egypt to pressure the Gulf states into giving him $30 billion in exchange for regional stability. To make his threat absolutely clear, Iraq held a bunch of military exercises right on the Kuwaiti border. In May, at a summit in Baghdad, he ramped up the pressure even more. He said, for every single dollar drop in the price of a barrel of oil, our loss amounts to $1 billion a year. War is fought with soldiers, but it is also done by economic means. Therefore, we would ask our brothers who do not mean to wage war on Iraq, this is in fact a kind of war against Iraq. We have reached a point where we can no longer withstand pressure. Asterisk, the Emir of Kuwait's response was short and simple. He called Saddam's demands absurd. Frustrated and out of options, Saddam decided to go with a military solution. On July 15, 3 Iraqi divisions, with 35,000 troops and over 300 tanks, began moving toward the Kuwaiti border. Saddam declared that Kuwait was conspiring with world imperialism and Zionism, and said his military action was a necessary move to protect the Arab nation. The Kuwaitis, for their part, rejected what they called threats and extortion. The Gulf states, worried about things getting out of hand, asked the United States not to react too strongly. On July 17th, the U.S. made it clear that they would uphold the sovereignty and integrity of the Gulf states. They were concerned that an Iraq that dominated the region would threaten their oil supplies, be a danger to Israel, and undermine the independence of other smaller, oil-rich nations. Asterisk, by July 27th, The Iraqis had 100,000 troops on the Kuwaiti border. But the threat was largely dismissed as just a bluff. People believed that all the assurances we got said not to worry. Yes, there's a bit of a problem. Yes. The Iraqis are posturing, but they would not attack an Arab brother. You should not worry about this. But the US and everyone else had completely misjudged Saddam's intentions. On August 2, 1990, his troops went into Kuwait. At 2 a.m., the Iraqi Hammurabi and Medina armored divisions crossed the border with 1,000 T-72 tanks, while Iraqi Republican Guards commandos landed in Kuwait City via helicopter. They faced minimal resistance from Kuwait's small military. By the end of the day, the Emir of Kuwait had fled, and his brother was killed while trying to protect the royal palace. Just 48 hours later, Saddam had completely occupied Kuwait. He stole $2 billion from the Kuwaiti central bank and doubled Iraq's oil reserves. The UN Security Council unanimously condemned the invasion and demanded that Iraqi troops pull out. Saddam hoped that a quick victory would prevent other countries from mobilizing against him. But instead, it did the opposite. It brought Western, Soviet, and Arab leaders together. By invading, Saddam lost all trust with Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, and the overthrow of a Gulf monarchy seriously alarmed the kings of Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Most importantly, Iraq had messed up the balance of Middle Eastern oil production and put global economies at risk. In the West, Saddam's invasion was seen as a blatant attack on a friendly state. American defense officials also started to worry that Iraq might attack Saudi Arabia, which would further jeopardize oil supplies. This was a huge shift from the limited support the US had given Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War just a few years earlier. Even in Moscow, where Iraq was a former ally, the invasion was a surprise. Like the Americans, the Soviets had investments in Kuwait. Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev let Saddam know that the Soviets would not be supporting him. Iraq had conquered Kuwait, but with powerful countries and neighbors now turning against him. Saddam's move looked like a crazy gamble. On August 6th, the UN imposed an embargo on Iraq, a country that depended on oil for 90% of its national budget. That same day, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia allowed American troops to deploy in Saudi territory to deter Iraqi aggression. For the time being, it wasn't clear if Saddam actually planned to invade Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis were definitely on edge. On August 8th, American President George H. Bush addressed the nation, saying, "At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia. I took this action to assist the Saudi Arabian government in the defense of its homeland. First, we seek the immediate, unconditional, and complete withdrawal of all Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Second, Kuwait's legitimate government must be restored to replace the puppet regime." Saudi Arabia agreed to host and supply the US-led coalition. Jordan, which was opposed to Iraq's growing power, bore the brunt of refugees fleeing the escalating conflict. So they and other Arab states also offered their support and troops to the coalition. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was very eager to get involved, while France was furious after Iraqi troops stormed their embassy in Kuwait, so they joined in as well. As up to 200,000 Kuwaitis and other people fled into Saudi Arabia. They brought with them stories of widespread looting and killing, which gave the coalition an additional moral reason to intervene. One Kuwaiti refugee recounted, "Plenty of the soldiers came to our house. They were searching for guns. Anything that make us Kuwaiti, that means we are Kuwaiti. They took everything, passports, ID, everything you had." However, widely reported testimony about Iraqi troops killing babies by removing them from incubators were later revealed to be completely made up by a Kuwaiti public relations campaign. Saddam tried to break up the growing coalition before it could fully mobilize. First, he tried to separate the Arab states by claiming that Israel, which most of them considered an enemy, controlled the U.S. Israel. However, made the deliberate choice to stay out of the coalition to avoid provoking the Arab members. Second, Saddam took hundreds of foreign nationals from 49 different countries as hostages. He said he would guarantee their safety if the U.S. and its allies didn't attack Iraq. But this move totally backfired and pushed the coalition even more towards a military solution. Meanwhile, more and more countries pledged to support the coalition, offering everything from single planes and ships to financial help and troops. In the end, 42 countries joined, with the United States, UK, France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Kuwait leading the charge. As the coalition built up its forces, Saddam ordered his army to build defensive lines around Kuwait, and the line in the sand was drawn. A massive logistical operation called Desert Shield was underway in Saudi Arabia to support the coalition. Saudi ports were at maximum capacity as American military shipments arrived around the clock. Engineers built new highways for thousands of convoys and equipment from 1,000 cargo planes. In just 90 days, the U.S. alone shipped ammunition, uniforms, medical equipment, and food for 157,000 troops, along with tanks, artillery, helicopters, and combat aircraft. The U.S. military set up a 1,000 square kilometer training area to help troops get used to the climate. The entire operation used more than 75 million liters of fuel every day. Alongside this massive American force, Egyptian, Syrian, Saudi, and British divisions also began deploying with support from other allies. 10 Iraqi divisions dug in deep along the front line, building trenches filled with oil, huge minefields, and setting up artillery to target key choke points. Saddam's elite Republican Guards Corps were kept as a strategic reserve, while regular Iraqi divisions were on the front. Saddam, thinking about the Vietnam War, hoped that Western nations, which he saw as afraid of casualties, wouldn't risk attacking his well-fortified defenses. On December 6th, he announced the release of all remaining foreign hostages, a final attempt to stop the coalition from launching an attack. Instead, the UN gave him a deadline to withdraw by January 16, 1991. Some coalition partners were concerned that Saddam might only partially withdraw, still keeping some influence in Kuwait, which would make a full intervention seem less necessary. But Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney made it very clear the U.S. was ready to strike, saying, "It doesn't mean a partial withdrawal. And it doesn't mean he gets to keep 10% or 20% or 30% of what he stole. It means the full, complete, and total withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait. He needs to be aware that the president will have available to him a full spectrum of capabilities and were Saddam Hussein foolish enough to use weapons of mass destruction? The U.S. response would be absolutely overwhelming, and it would be devastating. Ultimately, Saddam ignored the ultimatum, determined to hold on to his conquests despite the looming threat of military action. The coalition then launched Operation Desert Storm. At 3 a.m. on January 17, 1991, coalition forces began a huge air campaign over Iraq. 2,430 coalition aircraft, including 323 American carrier-based planes, filled the skies. Iraq's air defense network of hardened bunkers, anti-aircraft guns, surface-to-air missiles, and 300 interceptor aircraft was completely overwhelmed. First, Apache helicopters and missiles took out Iraqi radar installations, blinding their anti-air defenses and allowing for the main attack. On the first day alone, the coalition launched over 1,300 sorties, including with F-117 stealth jets. Over the first 3 days, they completely crippled the Iraqi Air Force, hitting 44 airfields and over 500 aircraft shelters. The few surviving Iraqi jets fled, and the coalition gained complete control of the air. Lieutenant Colonel Waldo B. Cummings Jr. described his first mission as "We penetrated Iraqi airspace. I looked down and saw the biggest light show I had ever seen. Continuous lines of red and orange tracers covered the black void below us. It seemed that every Iraqi who could put his finger on a trigger had pressed down and wouldn't let go. They were Surface 2 missiles fired blindly in the hope that one would hit something. Several miles from the target, I pushed the nose of my aircraft down into a 30-degree dive as Condor. My bombardier navigator picked out his aim point on the radar. The target below was engulfed in flames and secondary explosions. Baghdad was hit hard with bombs and cruise missiles, with strikes on Iraq's presidential palace, government buildings, and Saddam International Airport, confused by decoys, and targeted with anti-radar bombs. Iraqi defenses only managed to shoot down 12 American aircraft throughout the entire campaign. Iraqi soldiers on the front were worried about what was happening back home. One soldier from the 3rd Corps wrote in his diary, "One says they have destroyed Baghdad and demolished it. Others come to pacify you, saying nothing has happened there. They have only bombed the military installations. Others say they have bombed the civilian buildings. You don't know who to believe and who is lying. All news reports are hallucinations. They are all lying. The truth is lost." In response to the coming coalition invasion, the Iraqi military set demolition charges on hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells, determined to destroy the country's infrastructure. Some oil wells were also hit during the aerial bombing. The thick smoke covered the whole area, causing massive pollution and making the sky dark even during the day. Iraq also used its arsenal of tactical Scud missiles. On January 18th, they launched the first of 86 Scud missiles at civilian and military targets in Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saddam hoped this would break the fragile coalition by dragging Israel into the conflict against the wishes of the U.S. and Arab states. However, U.S. Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf downplayed the military importance of the Scuds, saying that Israel understood the provocation. "I frankly would be more afraid standing out in a lightning storm in southern Georgia than I would be standing out in the streets of Riyadh when the Scuds are coming down. If it's going to hit you, it's going to hit you, but the percentages are so much less. I think the state of Israel understands that the exact objective Saddam Hussein is trying to obtain by attacking them with SCUDs is to drag them into this war. And if they were to come into this war, they are doing exactly what Saddam wants them to do, and that's certainly not in the best interest of everyone involved." Despite the Scuds being inaccurate, the Israelis took the threat seriously and took precautions. Ultimately, they stayed out of the conflict, partly because the U.S. promised them billions of dollars in military aid and sent Patriot air defense batteries. Schwarzkopf also sent SAS and Delta Force teams to hunt down the Scud launchers. Saddam also tried other ways to provoke the coalition into costly attacks, like launching a cross-border raid into the Saudi town of Khafji on January 29th. Although the Iraqis briefly took over the town, coalition forces, backed by overwhelming air power, quickly recaptured it. The Battle of Khafji perfectly demonstrated the power of the coalition's air force, which then began a theater-wide offensive. From January 24th to February 24th, 40,000 attack sorties targeted command centers, naval installations, oil facilities, power infrastructure, logistics, and Iraqi troops within specific areas called kill boxers. These pre-established sections of the front line were assigned to aircraft, allowing them to respond to targets very quickly. Under the intense bombardment, up to 80,000 Iraqi conscripts deserted, and the attacks destroyed 1,385 Iraqi tanks, 930 other armored vehicles, and 1,155 artillery pieces. On February 24th, 500 coalition troops with 340 attack helicopters, 2,000 tanks, and 2,000 armored vehicles moved in, supported by a massive air and sea barrage. Their plan was a huge left hook movement to cut off Kuwait and the Iraqi army from behind. American Central Command, or CENTCOM, was in charge of the Western approach with American, British, and French forces, Arab and American Marine units, focused on the east. Meanwhile, Marine landing craft prepared a fake amphibious landing. This trick kept two Iraqi divisions on the coast when the main coalition force attacked, asterisk in the west. The French 6th Light Division and American Airborne divisions advanced rapidly. The 101st Airborne alone pushed over 270 kilometers into Iraq, using more than 300 helicopters. Iraqi troops on the front lines were demoralized after weeks of brutal air attacks and mass desertions. By evening, the airborne forces had already cut off Highway 8 between Baghdad and Kuwait, moving so fast that Iraqi troops offered little resistance and often surrendered in droves. In the center, American and British units launched direct attacks. Their goal was to capture the Iraqi logistics hub of Al Busayya and then turn east to surround the Iraqis. Tanks with bulldozer blades pushed through Iraqi berms and bulldozed tons of earth into Iraqi trenches, burying some soldiers alive. They cut 24 routes through the minefields, creating a 16-kilometer breakthrough zone. Iraqi armor and artillery, already destroyed by the air attacks, couldn't respond effectively. Asterisk Marine divisions pushed through rain, fog, and the thick black smoke from Iraqi oil trenches lit by American napalm. They broke through Iraqi defenses, and over 3,000 Iraqis surrendered almost immediately. The 1st Marine Expeditionary Force advanced over 20 miles into Kuwait, took over 10,000 prisoners, and captured Al Jabor airfield. By the end of February, 24 coalition troops had broken the Iraqi front line, but the fight wasn't over. The Iraqi Republican Guards Corps and Reserve were now deployed to stop the coalition from getting to the rear. Overnight and the next day, coalition forces advanced across the entire front. Syrian, Egyptian, and Saudi forces moved more slowly but pushed forward with support from the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division. The Marine divisions fought off large Iraqi counterattacks with minimal casualties. In one of many tank battles, 13 M1A1 Abrams tanks destroyed 35 Iraqi tanks in just 90 seconds. American armor was far superior to the Iraqi T-55, T-60, and T-72 tanks, with a 120mm main gun and depleted uranium armor-piercing rounds. The US M1A1 Abrams could penetrate the armor of any Iraqi tank. Stabilized barrels allowed well-trained tank crews to fire while moving, and thermal vision equipment gave them a huge advantage over Iraqi tanks fighting in the smoke from the burning oil wells. But the fires also caused problems for the coalition. Forces asterisk on February 26th as the coalition continued to surround Kuwait. On the flank of another massive tank battle, American armor clashed with the forward elements of the Iraqi Republican Guards Tawakkala Division. In the thick smoke from the oil fires and strong desert winds, aerial reconnaissance was difficult and ground visibility was low. American Bradley APCs and Abrams tanks fought against Iraqi BMPs and T-72s at close range. It wasn't until the 27th that the coalition was able to break through for good. 2 American soldiers were killed in the battle, both by friendly fire. American armor overran Iraqi positions with no losses, destroying 30 T-72 tanks in fortified positions. American radar also tracked Iraqi artillery positions, and U.S. guns destroyed them with counter-battery fire. The rapid pace of the advance completely surprised the Iraqis, who were expecting a direct assault from the south rather than from the west. Asterisk, as one U.S. soldier recalled, "We're located about right here." At this northwest-northeast cloverleaf, we swung up, came right through. Here by the airport, came around and then hit them from behind. And because when we came over these positions around here, most of them were pointing towards the south because they were expecting us to come up right through the city. There was not a whole lot of resistance. We hit them at night and they weren't really able to see us or shoot at us. Asterisk, by the end of February 26, coalition forces had defeated 24 Iraqi divisions. As Iraqi troops retreated from Kuwait City, they were trapped on the highway to Baghdad by coalition air power. Hundreds of stolen cars and military vehicles clogged the road as mostly U.S. planes attacked and bombed the column into twisted wreckage. Images of the so-called Highway of Death made headlines around the globe. Some Iraqi soldiers had already left their vehicles, but many others were killed. Asterisk, the next day. The 24th Division captured the Talil and Jaliba air bases, despite some Iraqi resistance. Highway 8 saw its own Highway of Death scenes as coalition. Aircraft ambushed panicked Iraqi armor and soldiers trying to flee or redeploy to the west. The Iraqi army had almost completely fallen apart under the coalition's assault. American, Saudi, and Kuwaiti units moved into Kuwait City. And the Emir of Kuwait asked for his own troops to enter the city as the main liberators. Before the Kuwaitis could even begin to rebuild the destroyed infrastructure, they still had to put out the oil fires, which took months. The Iraqi army was in ruins, and while Saddam Hussein's regime was shaken, it was still in power. Asterisk, as Saddam's forces retreated into Iraq, President Bush and the coalition had a decision to make. The war wasn't over, and the fleeing Iraqi forces were regrouping. But the coalition's goal was to kick Iraq out of Kuwait, not to pursue them into Iraq or overthrow Saddam's regime. It was likely that some coalition partners, especially the Arab states, would oppose an invasion of Iraq. Asterisk, one possible solution was to support a regime change, with Saddam's rule in crisis. Previously repressed ethnic and religious minorities saw an opportunity, and the U.S. encouraged them. The Voice of America promoted uprisings in mid-February, which President Bush reiterated on February 24th, partly encouraged by these statements. A diverse range of groups in Iraq started to mobilize against Saddam. Then, on February 28th, the coalition and Iraq agreed to a ceasefire. Bush then made it clear that the coalition's objectives had been achieved, and the fighting was over. Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. Kuwait is once more in the hands of Kuwaitis in control of their own destiny. I am pleased to announce that at midnight tonight, Eastern Standard Time, exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of effort, Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations. Asterisk, in early March in Basra, disgruntled Iraqi soldiers, including many Shiites, turned against government troops, buildings, and prisons, with the support of most of the Shia majority city. The partly spontaneous revolution soon spread to other Shia cities in the south. In the north, Kurdish Peshmerga militias also rose against Saddam. Helped by army defections, they took most northern Iraqi cities, often without a fight. Unlike the Basra-based revolution, the northern uprising had a more organized political agenda, including a demand for democracy in Iraq. Soon, there were revolts in 14 of Iraq's 18 provinces. Asterisk, the coalition members couldn't agree on how to react. The U.S. preferred a coup and an intact Iraq to keep its archenemy Iran in check, rather than have the country fall apart. They eventually sent humanitarian aid, some limited ground forces to support the Kurds, and established 2 no-fly zones over Iraq. Baghdad and Sunni-majority cities in the so-called Sunni Triangle largely remained loyal, as did the well-armed and mostly intact Republican Guard. Both the northern and southern uprisings were made up of many different political organizations, interest groups, and religious and ethnic groups. while they were united in their desire to overthrow Saddam, they could agree on very little else, including a power-sharing deal offered by Saddam on March 7th. Asterisk by late March, Saddam's loyalist troops were on the offensive. Against the fragmented revolutionary organizations, they crushed many of the uprisings by early April. They used tanks and helicopter gunships, which were not destroyed by the coalition earlier and were permitted under the ceasefire agreement, to suppress the lightly armed rebels and kill fleeing civilians. There were also widespread claims of the indiscriminate use of chemical weapons. The few remaining U.S. troops in Iraq near the Kuwaiti border did not get involved directly, but they did destroy captured arsenals to prevent them from falling into rebel hands. Some northern Kurdish groups did hold out, eventually creating an autonomous Kurdish region under the protection of Iran and the no-fly zone. Some revolutionaries felt betrayed by the lack of expected U.S. support. Asterisk, as Othman Mahmoud said, "I think we are disappointed really, not only by them, but also by the Allies' position. We think that during the war, everybody knew that Saddam Hussein is the cause of what happened in the Gulf, and they, even some of them, they asked the Iraqi people to rise up, to go up and get rid of Saddam Hussein. But when Iraqi people got up and had an uprising in all parts of Iraq, they look away. And they said, this is an internal affair. We don't interfere." Asterisk, the situation was made worse by the continuing economic embargo, which severely damaged Iraq's economy and public health. After Saddam's victory over the rebels, some influential Iraqi exile groups would pressure the U.S. to finish the job that was started in 1990 for the coalition in February 1991. The Gulf War almost seemed like the perfect intervention. Casualties were low, public support was high. Its political goals were quickly achieved, and they had built and maintained a diverse global coalition. Asterisk, the casualty count is a testament to how lopsided the conflict was. The coalition lost 292 people killed and 776 wounded, with roughly half of those being from friendly fire or accidents. The Kuwaiti army lost 420 killed and 12,000 captured. Estimates for Iraqi numbers are between 20,000 and 50,000 killed, more than 75,000 wounded, and 80,000 to 175,000 captured. Over 1,000 Kuwaiti civilians were killed or went missing, and over 3,000 Iraqis were killed during Desert Storm and Desert Shield. An additional 5,000 Iraqi troops and loyalists were killed in the Iraqi uprising, while up to 180,000 civilians and rebels were killed by government action or starvation. Coalition veterans also began to suffer from something called Gulf War syndrome, with symptoms similar to chronic fatigue or nerve gas poisoning. There is still debate about what caused it, with theories suggesting oil well fires, depleted uranium rounds, anti-nerve agent drugs, or exposure to nerve agents on the battlefield, either from deliberate Iraqi use or the destruction of Iraqi facilities. Up to 250,000 U.S. veterans, over a third of the combat force, have reported symptoms. Asterisk, Operation Desert Storm liberated Kuwait, but didn't stop Saddam from cracking down on internal opposition, and it left him with the tools to do it, killing and displacing hundreds of thousands of people. Most of the coalition troops left in 1991, though a few stayed behind to maintain some control over Saddam's regime and prevent Iraq's total collapse. The Gulf War created new and complex problems, and immediately there were voices in the U.S. government who were not happy with the results, which they would try to fix in the future. Asterisk, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait happened right as the Cold War was ending, and it was in that moment that the superpowers of the world agreed on something. In the UN Security Council, which would have been completely unthinkable just a few years earlier, Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to modernize the USSR, but ultimately failed, with some arguing that it was partly due to the economic cost of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 and its aftermath. Asterisk, this is where we leave the story for today. Found this deep dive into the First Gulf War as interesting as I did? This is just part 1. So don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of the story. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, share it with your friends, and leave a comment below to let me know what you thought. Thanks for watching.